if people want to ask questions as we go, that's okay with me. If they want to chime in, I'm happy to answer them then.
Okay.
If you know that with the Zoom world, I can't see you in the audience, so unless I hear something, so I'm happy to do that. And I am going to show the book cover. I'm just going to do it digitally when I start a slideshow in a minute. That is a bunch of images of the people and things involved in the Clotilda story, and a lot of pictures of the nation of Benin, where I went as part of the story. And as we go through the tale, you'll understand why I'm talking about those things. But first, I just want to say a little bit about what the Clotilda, why we're talking about the Clotilda, and why it's important in the history of the nation and in the future of the nation. So the Clotilda story is actually the origin story for the African diaspora globally. I don't mean just the African American diaspora. I mean, now I'm going to stand up and turn this air conditioner off so y'all don't have to hear it. So that's how different. Y'all are in 47 degrees and I got my air conditioner on. So the Clotilda is the origin story of the African diaspora. For so many people whose ancestors arrived in via the Atlantic slave trade in either South America or the Caribbean or the Americas, they know almost nothing about their history before the end of slavery, because those stories have all been lost. What's unique about the Clotilda story is how well documented it is. We know almost everything about the Clotilda story from the mouths of the people involved. You may have heard of Barracoon, the book Zora Neale Hurston wrote. That was an interview with Cujo Lewis, who is probably the most famous of the Clotilda captives, the people who were taken from Africa. He lived until 1935. So the reason we know so much about these people is because how late they were captured and brought to the United States. Slavery had actually been outlawed, not slavery, the importation of people had been outlawed since 1808 in the United States. The Atlantic slave trade had been outlawed. You could still own slaves in America, but they had to be born in the United States at that point, you know, the children of slaves. So people were being born into enslavement in the country. That was the only way to get new slaves. So that figures prominently into the Clotilda story, that had been outlawed for so long. Incidentally, so slavery became a capital crime. Transporting slaves across the ocean became a capital crime in 1808. Thomas Jefferson signed that into law, and then he and every other president up to Lincoln, 9 American presidents, names like Adams, I mean, the founding fathers of our nation, all pardoned convicted slavers. They all pardoned people who were caught between 1808 and 1860 with hundreds of people on boats bound for the illegal slave trade in the US. I just think that's interesting. Lincoln killed or executed the first person for slavery after the law had been in effect for 50 years. On the eve of the Civil War, the person that was executed, the captain that was executed, was caught 3 weeks before the Clotilda arrived back in America. So that's the scene when we go talk about that stuff. So with the Clotilda story, because it happened so late, by the time of the Civil War, almost every enslaved person in the United States had been born into slavery. They had never been to Africa. They didn't know that side of the thing. They didn't go through the Middle Passage. So those stories were kind of lost, and just they were told down through, you know, the generations, but the actual witnesses were no longer living for the most part. So with the Clotilda story, because it happened so late in 1860, with people who were between 12 and 25 years old, they lived into the 1930s. They were interviewed dozens and dozens of times. So we have the story from their mouths. We also have the story from the side of the white enslavers who traveled to Africa. So we know everything about the Clotilda saga, from, you know, the ship that went to Africa to purchase the people, that it took 27 pounds of gold to buy them. We know about the meetings with the Africans, the negotiations over the people. We know about the slave barracoons. Barracoon is a Spanish word that means fort. So these were prisons built by the other enslaving nations, Portugal, Spain, England, France, in the case of Benin, where all the people on the Clotilda came from. So we know everything about the story from the side of the enslavers. Then we know everything of the African experience because of the interviews with Cujo Lewis and 10 of the other Clotilda captives who survived into the 1900s. We have firsthand accounts of their lives before they were enslaved in African villages. Then we have accounts of African slaving raids where these people captured them. We know what their life was like in the Barracoon before they were shipped across the ocean. Then we have firsthand accounts of the Middle Passage. The Clotilda people's accounts are some of the only firsthand accounts of the Middle Passage in existence. So we have those. Then we have what their lives were like during slavery. And then we know what happened to them afterward, which in the case of the Clotilda captives, they made a town called Africa Town in Alabama that still exists today. Now, they called it African Town because they were modeling an African village. And I'm going to talk more about that as we do the slideshow. But this is the entire story of slavery from start to finish in one package. And now we have the ship. The Clotilda is an internationally important artifact. It is the most intact slave ship ever found. It is the only intact slave ship ever found. It is the only ship ever found that was involved in the US trade. So to have the story of these people from their mouths captured over decades by so many journalists, and then have the ship, this is a unique historical record unlike any other. So that's why I'm going to tell you the story of the Clotilda and about finding it. But that's what it means to the nation's history. That's what it means to the history, the globe's history. So I'm going to now try and share my screen and start the slideshow. If anything goes amiss, someone please chime in and tell me. And I'm happy to answer questions as we go. All right, here we go. Provided I can conquer the technology. Oh, all right, let's see. And we're going to share that. Oh, we got our slideshow in the middle of the show. We're going to have to go back to the beginning. All right. Okay, here we go. All right, I see a couple of you on screen. Give me a thumbs up if everything looks right. You can see you see the cover of the book there. Thank you for the thumbs up. All right. So here we go. So this is the cover of the book, and it depicts the scene of the Clotilda, which was burned in the giant swamp I was talking about earlier before we got started. And we will move on from that picture and get going with the story. Since I've already given you a bit of a preamble, this is Captain Timothy Mayer. This is the man who financed the entire Clotilda voyage. He was an Alabama steamboat captain. He came from Maine. He moved here in 1835. This was just a few years after Andrew Jackson ran all of the Native Americans out of Alabama. That's the Trail of Tears you always hear about. The people marched to Oklahoma. They came from Alabama. And so Alabama was this wide open frontier when Timothy Mayer arrived from Maine. And he got work as a steamboat captain, or steamboat deckhand, rather. Over the course of the next 30 years, he and his three brothers who came built up a fortune and built their own steamboats. So by 1860, the three Mayer brothers owned 9 steamboats. They had really prospered. Now, I don't know if y'all have ever seen the movie Jezebel with Betty Davis, I believe, but it's about yellow fever in the South during the antebellum era. As a side note, I will tell you the Mayers brought down other brothers and wives, and about 9 of them died of yellow fever during the first years in Mobile. And that's because of the association with the swamp. Anyway, that's a side note. So Timothy Mayer, by 1860, is incredibly wealthy. He's one of the richest people in one of the richest cities in America. The port of New York, and then New Orleans, and then Mobile were the 3 biggest ports in the United States. And Mobile was so big because it was providing more cotton than any other state in the nation. And it was the entire economy of Alabama. You know, Andrew Jackson ran the Indians out, and then farmers broke the land down immediately after into cotton plantations that escalated and escalated. So Timothy Mayer had become incredibly wealthy by carrying cotton downriver on these 9 steamboats. He and his 3 brothers also each had a plantation. Together, they had about 50 enslaved people that they forced to labor for them. And they had a shipyard where they built ships and their steamboats, and a lumber yard where they mined trees out of the forest all around and brought them to the mill to build ships and everything. So they were fabulously wealthy, some of the wealthiest people in Alabama. So the Clotilda story is all about committing a capital crime, bringing people into the country 50 years after it had been outlawed. This is a hanging crime. So why would this multimillionaire, in standards then and standards today, why would he risk his life to do this? And it was all about thumbing his nose at the federal government. Timothy Mayer had become fully invested in the Southern economy. He was now a plantation owner. He was a slave owner. And he had this shipping business dependent entirely upon the transport of cotton, which was entirely dependent upon slave labor. In fact, the crews of his steamboats were all enslaved people. So he had moved here and become fully invested in this Southern culture that existed at the time. So much so that the last steamboat he built was called the Southern Republic. Now, this was his way of saying, I want the South to secede and become its own country, a Southern Republic. So he was on his steamboat one night in 1859. He had, and the steamboats, you think of, Gone with the Wind, antebellum America, fabulously wealthy people. The steamboat was fabulously appointed, the upper decks. They're actually advertisements you can read that talk about how nice the accommodations were and the velvet couches and all that. So they would eat dinner in the main salon, and then after dinner, the men would go out on the deck, on the upper deck, and they would drink whiskey and smoke cigars and have lively talk. And so one night during this, on the regular run from Mobile, Alabama, north to Montgomery, and Mobile is the port for Alabama. It's still today, it's the port city. It's on the Mobile Bay, which butts up to the Gulf of Mexico. I feel like I have to explain that. When the oil spill happened, I was a reporter at the newspaper here writing about the oil coming ashore in Alabama. I would call people around the country, scientists and experts, and they would say, Alabama has a coast. And it was sort of a staggering thing, but we do. It's only 54 miles long, but it touches the Gulf of Mexico. And we have the whitest beaches in the world. They're quite famous. It's sugar quartz that comes down the Mobile River system through the swamp where the Clotilda was found, to make these white sand beaches that look like sugar. Anyway, that's an aside. So we're on the steamboat in 1859 one night, and Mayer is out there talking with some passengers, several of whom were Yankees. There were several from New York. There was a pharmacist from Rhode Island. They were out there talking, and they were talking about the news of the day. The news of the day was a story of a ship called the Wanderer, which came into Georgia. And the Wanderer brought in a load of illegal enslaved people, and they were quickly spread around the country. They successfully made it in. There are news accounts you can read, even in the New York Times, talking about the cargo of the Wanderer. A New York Times reporter in Montgomery, Alabama in 1860 wrote a dispatch describing the Africans who came in aboard the Wanderer and were spread to plantations in Alabama. So we know illegal slaving was going on prior to the Clotilda. The Clotilda's importance is it was the last ship before the Civil War. I don't want to dash anyone's opinions, but David Bowie, the whole the American frontiersman and all, he and his brother participated in illegal slaving activities with pirates on the Gulf Coast. That was how they earned a lot of money, actually. So Mayer's on the boat, and they're talking about the Wanderer. It was in the newspapers. It was written about in the New York Times, the New York Tribune, even though it happened in Georgia. And in fact, during the court case, when this guy, this man responsible for bringing in these people on the Wanderer, who had the fabulous name Charles Augustus Lafayette Lamar, he was on trial, and he challenged the editors of the New York Times and the New York Tribune to duels. Now, they weren't available to come duel him, but during the same court trial, he challenged a Navy Commodore who was testifying against him to a duel. And they actually went out in the street. They stopped the court for a minute, went out in the street and shot at each other. They both missed. The trial went on. So this trial is being written about in the newspapers, and Timothy Mayer and these people on a steamboat are reading about it. So one of them says, well, I think they should hang the lot of them. That'll scare anybody else off from doing this, from bringing in slaves. And Mayer gets upset and says, nonsense, they're going to hang nobody. I could go do this myself. And he bets them $1,000, which in 1860 was about $30. So he bets them $30,000 in our money that he says, I could go to Africa myself and bring in a load. And so that's the bet. And he then proceeds to do it. And the reason he made the bet was to thumb his nose at the government. And it was partly over the price of enslaved people. Because the Atlantic trade had been outlawed since 1808, the price of slaves in the South, where cotton was exploding, the price of the slaves had exploded too. So to buy a person in Mobile, Alabama in 1860 cost about $2,000, $60,000 in today's money. That same person in Maryland or Virginia, the northern slave states, was $500. So, 15,000, dramatically less. So that was the genesis for this bet. The South had begun to regard this price, of importing people from Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas to Alabama as a tax on the South, an unfair tax. So that was what Mayer was all about with making this bet. He wanted to thumb his nose at the government and say, we should reopen the trade. It's silly. We don't have the trade going on. I'm going to do this. So he contacted his neighbor, this guy. This is William Foster, who was a ship captain who built ships in Mayer's shipyard. He had 5 ships that worked under him. And they were basically 18-wheelers of the day. They were mid-sized schooners. The Clotilda was one of the ships he built to do things. The first 5 years the Clotilda existed, it traveled from Mobile to Mexico and various Caribbean ports, taking Alabama pine trees and oak trees, lumber, to the Caribbean and to Central America, and came back with oranges and bananas and rum and sugar, the products from those parts of the world. So Mayer knew that his neighbor, Foster, was building the fastest ships around. In fact, the Clotilda was well known for breaking speed records, going places and stuff. So that's why it fit Mayer's purposes. What he had in mind was not a typical slave ship trip. The slave ships of that era carried 1,000 to 2,000 captives in the holds. You've seen those images of people laying down on the decks and stacked in shelves like they're, like firewood. That's not what Mayer was going to do. Mayer was going to he wanted to get 172 people, but on the Clotilda, which Foster had built, it was 86 feet long and 26 feet wide. Pretty small ship. And they were planning to cram the hold as full of people as they could. So this is a 2-masted schooner like the Clotilda. The reason the Clotilda was so fast, Foster had done several things to make it fast. He had put copper on the hull, sheathed the wood hull in copper so that organisms like barnacles and moss and things couldn't grow on it, slowing the drag on the ship. And it covered the seams between all the wood planking, another source that could slow you down. And then he built extra tall masts so he could carry more sail. So the Clotilda was well known for being super fast. In fact, we know all the details about the Clotilda because of the ship licensing requirements back then. In fact, everything about the Clotilda, the kinds of wood it was made from, the style of design, how big the hold was, the width, the depth, the dimensions, all of that is recorded in the archives in Atlanta, because that was how they charged taxes on cargo coming in. It was all about, so they wanted to know everything about a ship so they could prove it was the same ship coming back and that there was no shenanigans going on where merchants would try and cheat based on cargo volumes. So he had a ship with his neighbor. He gave him 27 pounds of gold and said, I want you to go to Dahomey and buy a cargo of people. Dahomey was not a random pick. Dahomey is modern day Benin in Africa, which is next door to Nigeria and Togo and the Ivory Coast. So if you think of Africa as that shape with the big hump on the side, Benin is right here. This is Nigeria. The reason he picked that was because the Mobile Press Register, the newspaper I worked for 20 years here in Mobile, published an article in 1860 saying King Gizo of Dahomey is back in the business of selling people. Dahomey had been famous for 200 years already, almost 300 years, as a place you could get more slaves than any other place. In fact, a Dutch slave trader wrote a journal called Diary of a Dutch Slave Trader in the 1600s. And in it, he wrote that in most of the African slave ports, you could expect to get 3 or 4 people in a week. In Dahomey, you could get 1,000 people in a few hours. So the Dahoman Empire had industrialized slavery in a way almost unheard of. It was easily one of the most brutal regimes in world history. Its sole existence was built on capturing neighboring tribes and enslaving them for 300 years. And they'd become fabulously wealthy. You see, King Gizo here is dressed in what have to be expensive European silks. You see the patterns on his toga there. And then you see the fancy tassels on the hat, the plumes. I mean, this is the height of European fashion. If you saw a woman wearing this in a European capital in 1859, this was state of the art. So they were trading heavily with all of Europe, and they were incredibly well armed. The Dahoman army that marched on these other tribes was 50,000 strong, which was a quarter of the population of Dahomey. So 1 out of every 4 people was in the army to go attack places. They had these giant tents and temples. You know, Europeans came and wrote about the spectacle there over and over. And invariably, they wrote about how polite the Dahomans were, which is a real juxtaposition when you also learn how murderous they were. This is a view out of one of the barracoons in Dahomey. I mentioned these earlier when I was talking. So there were these 5 prisons in Ouidah, their slave port city, built by the slaving nations to facilitate the trade in people, so that the Dutch already had a whole bunch of enslaved people. The English already had a whole bunch of enslaved people penned up and ready to be bought and sold. And the Dahomans facilitated all of this. And Captain Foster, a lot of this we know because he kept this journal while he was there and wrote about all this stuff. And he talked about how fabulous the accommodations were for merchants. That's what they call them, the merchants' quarters. He talked about going to restaurants and having the finest liquors in Europe available. So Dahomey was an international port catering to the slave trade in every way. Well, by the time Captain Foster arrived in Dahomey, King Gizo was dead, and King Glele, his son, had become king. We know that in the year after King Gizo's death, his son Glele put on what they call a custom. So the native religion of Benin is voodoo. Benin is the parent country of all the voodoo religions in the world. Voodoo got to Brazil, got to Haiti, got to the Caribbean, got to Louisiana in the bodies of people captured in Benin. It was their native religion. So part of the religion, of course, has always been these sacrifices. And today they do animal sacrifices and things, Santeria and all that. Back then they killed people. We know that when Glele celebrated his father in this celebration called a custom, they killed 250 people, just ritualistically slaughtered them. And these were tribes they had captured. So that's the culture, we're dealing with. One of the most fascinating aspects are the Amazons. Now, of course, Dahomey was trading with the Amazons, selling people to Brazil. So that may be where the Amazon name came from. But when Cujo Lewis told his story to Zora Neale Hurston in Barracoon, he talked about the women coming into the village and cutting off everyone's heads. The way the Dahoman army attacked, they came at night. This army of 50,000 men surrounded the village. And when I say village, these were kingdoms, and there might be 2,000 or 3,000 people living in a walled compound with a chief, a king, and they were protected from attack by these. You see the wall in the background behind this woman. That is a heavily fortified wall built of giant logs. So these were sophisticated forts and things that the tribes had. So the Dahomans would come at night, the men would surround the tribe, and then this army of women would scale the walls using ladders, go into the villages and start cutting people's heads off. The way the Dahoman army attacked, they killed everyone who was not of slaving age. So anyone below the age of about 12 and over the age of about 30, they just killed. They left no one behind in the villages they attacked because they didn't want to have anyone come after them for revenge. So this is what happened in Cujo's village. And he writes about seeing these people cutting people's heads off in the night in the street. The whole village erupts in all these cries. because 5,000 of these Amazon women had come over the walls. The way the women, this force was started, and you see this woman's holding a gun, has multiple knives and swords attached to her, and she's holding a human head. The reason she's holding the head is because the Dahomans said they believed that you couldn't brag about having killed someone unless you had their head. So these women would scale the walls and all this. The reason there was this all-female army was there was a Dahoman king who had a twin sister. The king died, and the sister decided to adopt his identity. And in doing this, she said she would surround herself with a group of women to protect her as her bodyguards. And that grew into this armed force. Subsequent kings were impressed with how aggressive these women were and how well they had protected their queen, that they used them as well. And so this was built. And actually, Black Panther movie, I don't know how many of y'all saw that, that came out a few years ago. The warrior women of Wakanda were based on the Amazons of Dahomey. So that is the tribe, that Cujo was attacked by, that all of the Clotilda captives were attacked by. They were attacked by one of the most ruthless regimes in world history. We can see testimonials to how ruthless the regime was all over in Benin today. There are more than 1,000 underground villages in Benin. And these were places built between the 1600s and the late 1800s, where the village just moved underground. They farmed above ground in the daytime, but when night came, they went down into spider holes they dug in the ground where they had rooms and bedrooms and tables and chairs. You can go in these places today, more than 1,000 of them. So that tells you how scared the people were. And then there's this place that you're looking at the picture of. This is the village of Ganvi. Ganvi is in Benin. It's in a lake called Lake Nkui. And it is a village today of 50,000 people. It was started in 1704 by the Tofinu tribe, who decided to move into the middle of this lake 5 miles from land to avoid being captured by the Dahomans. So the Dahomans, with the Voodoo religion I mentioned, would not travel over water before battle. Their gods are mostly water-based, sea serpents and things. And it was literally, bad juju to travel over water before battle, so they wouldn't do it. So this tribe moved out 5 miles from shore into the middle of this lake and built houses on stilts. And there are 50,000 people out there today. This picture, you can see people are gathering to get water from that little shed in the lower right. Oh boy, that's a video, but I shouldn't play it because it probably won't play well over the internet. So here's another shot of the town. Here's some of the family members there. Incidentally, all those green plants you see that are floating on the water in the foreground and in the background, that's water hyacinth, native to the Amazon. How do you think it ended up there? The slave trade. Ships going back and forth from the Amazon for almost 400 years. This is the school in Ganvi. You see the boat on the right with all the people in it. That's a school bus. The kids are actually going to school being paddled in these boats. It was a fascinating place to go, but as a testament to the destructive power of the Dahomans, pretty extraordinary. So at this point, the tale is largely told through Cujo, thanks to Zora Neale Hurston's incredible work in Barracoon. I encourage y'all to read it. It is a brutal tale. He talks about a lot of things during the raid. Perhaps the most brutal is when he talks about they'd been marching for 3 or 4 days, and the Dahomans stopped, and they were all chained up, Cujo and thousands of other people. The Dahomans stopped and built giant fires because the heads of all of Cujo's village friends, family, and everything were starting to stink. The heads the Dahomans were carrying back to their capital in Dahomey as war trophies. So they smoked them over these fires for 9 days. If you can imagine Cujo and all these other people staring into these fires at these heads smoking on sticks, they're the heads of their friends and loved ones. It's just really unbearable, incredible. So this picture is going to be important as the talk goes on. This is a Fon person. The Dahoman tribe today they're the Fon. They speak Fon, and they have facial scarifications. You see the lines on this person's face? That's typical of Fon. Now Cujo had different markings. He was Yoruba. He did have a couple of cuts on his face, but his teeth were chipped. They had little ovals cut into them and things like that. In Africa, even today, you can tell what tribe someone is from, often from these facial scarifications. So this is the slave road. This is the old road that you can still walk down today, that Cujo and everybody on the Clotilda had to walk down. And this is the tree of remembering. And this is talked about in all of their texts. They were told to walk around this tree. If you look above the statue, you can see some beautiful flowers hanging from the tree. It's quite a gorgeous tree. But they would walk every enslaved person who was being deported from Africa around this tree 3 times, so that their soul would know how to get back home to Africa after they were dead in whatever country they were being sent to. You know, the Dahomey, the voodoo culture is very big in ancestor worship and things. So they even then were cognizant that they were doing something terrible to these people they were deporting. And I use the word deporting. When I was in Benin, I was talking to a woman in the government, and she said something that was sort of struck me as kind of profound, that people think slavery happened in Africa. And she said, no, slavery is what happened to the people when they got to America or Brazil or the Caribbean. What happened in Africa was Africans capturing other Africans, stealing them away from their land, their wealth, and their families, and shipping them across the ocean forever. And that is what happened in Africa. That is the scar that is still present today. So this is what the Clotilda would have looked like with the people in the hold. The space was a little less than 5 feet tall. They would not have been able to stand up fully. They were naked. They were chained in groups of 8. They had chains around their necks and were chained to the floor in groups of 8. There's a picture of Cujo in his 80s at his house in Africa Town, at his well. This is him and his wife. So he, you know, survived everything that we're talking about, and he and this woman had 5 children. And the second great tragedy of his life was that his wife and all 5 of his children died by the time he was about 60, and he lived into his 90s. This is a picture inside his cabin, and you see the newspaper on the walls, you know, to keep out drafts and things. You see he has actually 3 quite nice boater hats, which would have been popular in the 1920s. And then you see all the chairs stacked in the corner with junk and debris stacked on them. And those are all the chairs his missing family members aren't sitting in. He couldn't read or write. He could recite a lot of Bible verses, but I just always think of him in this cabin at the last 30 years of his life, you know, with nothing to occupy himself, but all these horrible memories that, you know, as he told Zora Neale Hurston his story, he would start crying, talking about the things that we've just been talking about. Just what a psychic scar to bear. This is actually the last thing left in Africa Town that was built by the Africans. And they actually built a community that grew and grew and grew. They bought land from the people who enslaved them in about 1870, and they built a town on it, and they ruled it according to the African ways they'd all grown up with. That road you see in the background, the city of Mobile built that in 1992, at which point they took all of the original homes built by the Africans and destroyed them. They all lived right along this road, and this chimney is the last thing left. So if you can imagine, 1992, the descendants of these people who came from Africa on the Clotilda were living in the houses their ancestors built. And the Africans built them together. You know, there were 2 really profound things about the African group that ensured their survival through everything they were put through. They stuck together and they fought back. And when I say they fought back, we can see that in the earliest days they were here in America. There are several famous stories. I'll just tell you one. An overseer on Timothy Mare's plantation started whipping one of the women out in the cotton field. I guess she wasn't working fast enough to suit him. The Africans en masse charged him, tackled him, took the whip, and beat him with the whip until other overseers were able to come and get them off of him. Cujo says about that story, nobody beat an African woman with a whip after that. And so they fought back, but they also teamed up. After they were freed, they bought this land together and they built each other's houses. They built a school. It's one of the really fascinating parts of the Clotilda story. Now this slide is in here for this paragraph that's in the middle of the page. I quit the river in 1870 when the colored citizens demanded cabin passage. So this is Timothy Mare talking in an interview shortly before he died. And what he's saying is he quit the steamboat industry when they told him he had to let African Americans use cabins on the ship instead of sleep in the steerage area. Now, what's really interesting and struck me about this was we're in 1870, and he was going to be forced legally to allow African Americans to use every accommodation on the ship. At the time in America, in Alabama, African Americans could go in any restaurant, stay in any hotel, do anything they wanted. It was only in the years after that this whole separate but equal segregated world sprang up. And it began in 1874, just 4 years after this article. So now we're getting into the story of how I found the ship, which began with a phone call from a friend of mine who used to work with me at the newspaper. And he called me up and said, hey, you should go look for the Clotilda. And I didn't really know anything about the ship. I'd been an investigative reporter in Mobile for 18 years at that point, and had never once thought of looking for it because I didn't really understand that it was missing. I knew the loose bones of the story, that the last ship to bring enslaved people to America came into Mobile, but I had no idea it was illegal at the time. And I didn't know that they had burned the ship. So the reason they burned the ship was because of Timothy Mehr's big mouth. Timothy Mehr, immediately after the ship left Alabama, started blabbing to anybody who would listen about what they were doing because he was so proud that he was thumbing his nose at the federal government. He did this so much that about 3 days after the Clotilda left America, a newspaper article appeared in the Mobile paper saying the Clotilda has left for Africa for a cargo of slaves, which was a federal crime. By the time the ship was coming back 3 months later, Mehr had run his mouth so much he was being watched by the federal government, and they were going to try and catch the ship coming back. So the original plan was for the Clotilda to come back to Alabama, sneak in. Mehr would take all of the captives off of it on a steamboat, and the Clotilda would leave and go to to Mexico and be refitted and redesigned and come back to America as a new ship with a different name. But the heat was on, and Mehr knew it. So instead of posting a guard down at the beach to watch for the ship like he was supposed to do, he did nothing. The ship arrived and was actually here for a couple of days as Captain Foster waited for the lookout to notice they were there and send the steamboat. Ultimately, Foster had to get in a rowboat, go to shore, walk to a town about 5 miles away, and borrow a horse and buggy to go to Mobile and get Timothy Mehr to come get the ship. They come in the dead of night, they take the ship, they cut the masts off to tow it up into the Delta through Mobile Bay past 2 federal forts where Mehr was worried they would be captured. And so when they went up into the swamp, you see all these different rivers here. This is the giant swamp I'm talking about. And this looks like the Okefenokee with cypress trees in the water. Looks like anything in Louisiana. It is a southern swamp, and you see all these waters. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the largest wetland complexes in the United States. It is a network of rivers, 13 miles wide, with all kinds of islands and channels and snaking, twisting things. It's 60 miles long, huge swamp. So their plan was to come up, you see all the rivers, the city of Mobile is on the very left side of the image, and you can actually see the edge of it down there. Their plan was to come up one of these rivers in the middle and sneak past the city of Mobile into the swamp. And they were going to go up to an area of the swamp and burn the ship to hide the evidence. Now, Foster was mad about this because he was supposed to get to keep the ship, which was worth about $1 million. But Mehr said, no, we're going to just burn it and we're going to get away from here. So people began looking for the Clotilda the day after it arrived. 2 days after the Clotilda arrived in America, there was another article in the Mobile Press Register that said, the Clotilda has returned with 110 captives. They have been spirited up into the heart of Alabama aboard steamboats and spread to plantations far and wide. 2 days after it arrived, that was known and in the newspaper. And then that article was printed all around the country announcing this crime. So the federal government started looking for the ship immediately, trying to find it and looking for the captives. They never found it. Neither did anybody else in the next 160 years. There was a guy in Mobile named Jack Friend, who was a historian, who wrote the best history of the Battle of Mobile Bay, which was a pivotal Civil War battle. Mobile was the last port that was not blockaded. So it was the only way for weapons and supplies to get into America for the Confederate forces. So the Battle of Mobile Bay, that's where Damn the Torpedoes was said and all that. So Jack Friend, after he wrote that book, decided to find the Clotilda. Clive Cussler, the novelist, if any of you are fans of his, he also wanted to find the Clotilda. He found the Hunley, the first submarine ever used in war, which was a Civil War ship. And then his next target was the Clotilda, but the state wouldn't let him come look because Jack Friend was looking. Jack Friend spent tens of thousands of dollars looking for the ship up in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, this big swamp, but he never found it. The reason he never found it is because he listened to Timothy Meagher. Timothy Meagher had become very famous in the 30 years after the Clotilda arrived back in America as the last slaver. He was written about, the New York Times wrote an obituary of Timothy Meagher when he died, giving you an idea of how famous he was. So Meagher gave these interviews over and over. Well, I mentioned Africatown had begun to prosper. By 1912, Africatown was the fourth biggest city in the United States governed by Africans. Or governed by African Americans, rather. So that, which is incredible. It had gone from 30 people to 12,000 people. So it was also very famous. People would come write about Africatown and the Africans, and they would invariably write about Timothy Meagher. In every interview he gave, he named a different place where the ship was burned. And so Jack Friend spent all his money looking all the places Timothy Meagher said the ship was burned. Bayou Connaught, he named all the Bayou Combust. He always named these different places. They are not where I found the ship. I found the ship thanks to work in a library. That's where I really found it. I mean, I found it in the water and all that, but it started in a library. And there were several key documents. One was this piece of paper you see here. And right in the middle of the page, you see the phrase 12 Mile Island. And he says he sailed the ship into the Alabama River at 12 Mile Island. And then he says down at the bottom where it's underlined, I did not underline this. This is his journal, by the way, from the ship, which you can see. I then burned my schooner to the water's edge and sunk her. Now he's saying here he sank it at 12 Mile Island, but none of the historians or authors who wrote books about the Clotilda ever paid any attention to this. They all followed Meagher's seemingly much more detailed story about how they had put the ship in this other place. He had this whole elaborate lie that he told. But here it was, the captain who sailed the ship to Africa saying he burned it in 12 Mile Island. And then I found another clue, which was an article Cujo Lewis did in the 1890s, where he said the ship was burned at 12 Mile Island. Now, Cujo wouldn't have known 12 Mile Island the night the ship was burned when he had first arrived in America, but he spent the next 5 years as a slave on Meagher's steamboats, going up and down the rivers. When Zora Neale Hurston interviewed him in 1927, and he was 87 years old, he listed the first 21 landings up the Mobile River in perfect order. So I knew he knew the river. I also knew that he knew a guy named James Dennison. James Dennison was a Cherokee Indian who was enslaved by the Meaghers before the Clotilda ship came back. They had taught Dennison how to drive steamboats, and he drove one of the steamboats the night the Clotilda arrived. Then Dennison married one of the Africans who came on board the Clotilda. And he and Cujo were friends for the rest of their lives until they were old men. So there was no way James Dennison didn't tell him, oh, we burned it at 12 Mile Island. So then I had two eyewitnesses that night saying 12 Mile Island, where I knew nobody had ever looked. So this is the 12 Mile Island area. I went up there and started looking along this shoreline, and I found a ship. I found a schooner from the 1850s. I found it that y'all were experiencing the bomb cyclone in January of 2018. In fact, this picture was taken January 2nd, 2018. When you had that horribly brutal storm, down here, we had intense north winds that blew all the water out of the swamp. The actual shoreline is way up there past the mud. You can't see this ship I found when the normal water levels. The water was 3 to 4 feet lower than normal because of the north winds. So I just went up there in my boat to 12 Mile Island, rowed my boat along the shore and found this ship. And so I wrote a story saying this may be the Clotilda. I had archaeologists I'd brought to the site. I was quoting all of them and used the word may a lot. So the story went viral immediately. So viral that 2 days later, after the story ran, the ambassador of Benin had flown from Washington, D.C. and was on my boat at this site doing a Vodun ceremony on behalf of the government of Benin to ask for forgiveness from the ancestors of the people who arrived on this ship. That was actually a very powerful experience. He was drinking gin and he would spew it out of his mouth into the water. And then he was talking in Fon in these low, forceful tones. And then eventually he was yelling and screaming and crying. This is a man in a three-piece Armani suit. And after he had done this for a minute, he said, "I am so sad. I have to get out of here. Can we leave this spot?" So we left. That night at dinner, he told me a little of what was going on. He said, "I am a prince of Dahomey. I am a direct descendant of King Lele, who sold the people on the Clotilda. And my mother, my father is Fon, he's Dahoman. My mother is Yoruba. That's the tribe of Cujo, who was captured." He said, "I was begging my mother's ancestors to forgive my father's ancestors for selling it." So that's the thing going on in Benin today, in Africa today. They are having a reckoning there, similar to our discussions about reparations here for descendants of enslaved people. There, it's much more out in the open because the Fon, the Dahomans, are still the dominant ethnic group in Benin. They control all the levers of government, and all the tribes that were captured are all there in Benin. Benin is about the size of Pennsylvania or Alabama or New York. And so if you can imagine, the Dahomans spent 300 years capturing a total of 4 million people from the rest of that area, the size of that state. So, that kind of puts a little bit of perspective on it. So today in Benin, you can tell what tribe someone is, whether they were a Fon with the facial scarifications, the tribe that captured everyone, or one of the tribes that was being captured. And the government is actually worried about this in the context of a genocide like the Rwandan genocide, which was a tribal resentment gone awry. So anyway, I found this ship. I wrote this article. People were very excited. Africa Town was a buzz. They had shirts made that said, "Our ship has come in." They were talking about putting it on display in a museum. The fact that, the descendants of the Clotilda captives, many of them still live in Africa Town today, in the town founded by their relatives in 1870. So you can imagine how excited they would be that the ship that had brought their ancestors here might have been found, solving this great crime. Oh, we missed a picture. Here we go. But 2 months later, a team of archaeologists from the Slave Wrecks Project came to Alabama and investigated my ship and figured out it couldn't be the Clotilda because it was about 40 feet too long. When we measured it, the width was right. It was perfect. And all the design features were right. And it was from the 1850s. But the archaeologists I had up with me, January, it was 20 some degrees. We couldn't tell how long it was because the ship disappeared into the mud. So it turned out to be too long. So they had a meeting in Africa Town and announced this to about 300 people in this room, descendants, and said it's not the Clotilda. People cried. People were shouting at the state officials, telling them they were lying, that it was the Clotilda, and they were trying to hide it from them. It was a rough day as a journalist. I pride myself on never having corrections and doing good work. And here, the biggest story I'd ever done, I'd totally blown it. My central premise was wrong. So I was planning to go home and drink a bunch of whiskey and never look for the Clotilda again. As I was leaving the meeting, a descendant came up to me, this woman, Thelma Mabin Owens, and she wrapped me in a big hug and she started singing a song in my ear. There's a bright side somewhere. Don't give up until you find it. And it's a gospel song you can look up. And then she let go of me and held me by the shoulders and said, "Ben, don't give up. Keep looking until you find it." And I just felt this sort of like, wow, okay. And I wanted to cry. It was like this powerful moment. I turned and walked away from her, and two archaeologists came up to me, marine archaeologists who had found a Dutch ship out in the Gulf of Mexico from the 1700s. So they were kind of famous. And they told me they had looked for the Clotilda. They said, "We were hired by the state of Alabama to find two Confederate ironclad warships in the Mobile River near Mobile because they're thinking about digging them up and putting them on display." The Cairo is a Civil War era ironclad on display in Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's a huge tourist draw. So Alabama was looking to pull some Confederate ships up as a tourist draw. So these guys said, "We found the ships and we spent the rest of our time looking in the Mobile River all the way up to 12 Mile Island." So right then I knew the Clotilda could not be south of 12 Mile Island because of these guys. I knew it couldn't be north of 12 Mile Island because Jack Friend had looked everywhere up there. So 12 Mile Island, it's an island. The west side is the main river channel that all the ships go up, even back then, because it's much deeper. There's a lot more water. The east side is very shallow and treacherous. You would not want to take ships through there. The east side had never been surveyed. The west side had been surveyed over and over and over to maintain the shipping channel. So all of a sudden I have a location and I know nobody's ever looked for it before. So I know that you can't see the ship from a boat at low water, because the one ship I found that way was not the Clotilda. So I called the University of Southern Mississippi, where a friend of mine was the head of marine sciences for the entire university. And I knew they had a remote sensing boat. So the way you look for a ship and pirate treasure is with a couple of devices. One is called a sub-bottom profiler that you tow behind the boat that looks under the mud. It's sonar that can look under the mud and see things. Then there's a side scan sonar, which looks along the water and looks out to the side of the boat. It could see objects on the mud, on the surface, and a magnetometer, which detects metal. And these old ships were full of metal. They were made with these huge iron nails, blacksmith nails about this big. So we went up there and I called Monty rather and said, would you guys do this? I need a survey of the river. Now these surveys typically cost about $10,000 a day. So Monty's first question was, what's your budget? And I said, I have no money whatsoever. And he said, okay, we'll do it. I'd like to help Africa Town. It'd be good for the grad students. So they came over with their boat and we went up the river. We surveyed this 2-mile stretch on the backside of the island for a full day. And then they went back to Mississippi and crunched all the data for a week. And then they produced a chart for us that a topographic map has the lines getting closer and closer to show elevation. These charts, the depth charts, the water charts use color. So they're yellow and red and orange, depending how deep the water is. So we went back out. This is now 2 weeks after the archaeologists all came to Mobile and said, that's not the Clotilda, and left town with nobody looking for it anymore. So we went back out and we surveyed all 11 spots that the University of Mississippi had found, Southern Miss had found, that might be the Clotilda. And none of them, we ruled them all out. They were either too big to be the Clotilda, too small to be the Clotilda, or were made of metal and not made of wood like the Clotilda. So looked like we had struck out. I called the survey up on my phone and was scrolling through it and looking at it. And the dive guy we had, the dive supervisor who was on the boat to be our safety guy, he owns a dive shop, was looking over my shoulder and he pointed at something on my phone and said, what's that? And it was this shape on the phone that was slightly different color because of different water depth. And I said, I don't know, it looks like a shoe. And he said, not to me, that looks like a ship. Let's go look at that. So we called back to the lab in Mississippi. They gave us GPS coordinates for the shoe. We went to the shoe. And I was the only one who'd get in the water. The other guys were cold and didn't want to put on their cold wetsuits. It was almost 4 years ago today that this happened. It was April 10th. And so I was the only one who'd get in the water, and I kept pulling all these logs off it. I'd go underwater and come up with a log and move it out of the way. They were laughing at me saying I'd found a pile of firewood. And then I felt something under my foot. And when I reached down to it and touched it, it was squared off. I could tell it was a hewn piece of lumber and been sawn, with a saw. And this is it. It's the first piece of the Clotilda to see the light of day in 160 years. And right there by my left hand, you can see something sticking up out of it, which is a blacksmith nail. This is a square nail made by a blacksmith. You see the banding in there? That's from the blacksmith folding the metal over and beating it again and again. In the 1850s, there were no screws, no nuts, no bolts. Ships were made with giant nails. And so that's a definitive technique for aging something. So right away, we knew we had found something from the 1850s. In short order, we'd figured out it was a ship. The lab in Mississippi told us it was a little less than 90 feet long and about 28 feet wide. Clotilda was 86 feet long and 27 feet wide. So we knew we had found a ship from the 1850s, almost exactly the same size as the Clotilda. And we knew there was nothing else in the river around 12 Mile Island that could be the Clotilda. And we knew the ship had been burned because the wood was burned. So this all started to fit together. This is Monty Graham that I was talking about. I put his picture in here because he did the survey for free. So you know, we want to see his picture. Let's see. So we can't look at that because that's a video. This picture, you can see the Clotilda. This is an image I made, as is this, with my depth finder on my boat. I got a new depth finder about a month ago. These are new pictures. If I'd had this depth finder when I was looking for the Clotilda, I would have found it like that. Because look, you can see the ship. The bow is in the upper part of the picture where it comes to a point. You can see the sides of the ship going back. You know, there it is laying on the bottom, buried in the mud. Quite extraordinary. Africa Town had a huge celebration, you know, giant party. The community was instantly excited that they were going to be able to tell their story. And then this fellow came. This is Dada Dagbo Hunanhuli II, who is basically the Pope of the Voodoo religion. So Vodun is a real religion in Benin. It is it's the national religion. About a little more than a third of the population are Vodun adherents, and then the rest are Christians or Muslims. But even the Christians and Muslims still follow many of the tenets of Vodun as far as ancestor worship. They have shrines in their homes and things like that. The woman on the left in the picture is the Queen Mother. She is the mother of Dada Dagbo's children. Dada means king in Fan, so he is King Dagbo. His father before him was the head of the Voodoo religion, and his father before that. Dada Dagbo is also a lawyer and a labor negotiator. So this is quite an array of job descriptions. His business card also describes him as the Roi de Mer. It was the king of seas and oceans. So this, you know, a lot of titles. He actually named me a son of the sea. So I took him up the river. He was sent here by the government of Benin to do a religious ceremony at the site of the Clotilda, to ask the people on board to forgive them for having sent them across the ocean, which was really extraordinary. Well, Dagbo invited me to come visit him in Benin. So I went. This is passport control, and I'm next in line. And when I got up there, this fellow looked at my passport and said, États-Unis. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, Trump, in a very aggressive tone. Now, just before I mentioned the first ambassador of Benin that was on my boat, the week before he was here in Mobile was when Trump made his shithole countries comment, and he was making it specifically about Benin. So the people in Benin were a little hot about this. So when this guy said to me, Trump, I looked at him for a second and I held my hand up and I did this. And he said, Bienvenue à Benin, because I had thumbs down Trump. This point carried on further in a nightclub I went to one night in Cotonou, the big city. They heard I was from America, and a group of people stood up and started chanting, Obama, Obama, Obama. It was kind of a fascinating thing to see that happen. So this is the pool on the roof of my hotel in Cotonou. Cotonou is a city of about 750,000 people. And this is the view from the edge of the balcony by the pool. So Benin is fully a third world country. Those are coconut palms you see growing all over. Some of those giant trees in the background that you see, those are mango trees. Their mango trees are like oak trees here or magnolia trees. They're gigantic and covered in mangoes. People walk down the street and grab a mango as they're going by and eat it. And they're just everywhere. It's kind of fascinating. This is the big market. This is a little shop stall in the big market. I bought a bunch of clothes from this guy. He sized me up and he handed me all these clothes, said, these are your size. I got home. It was like he was dressing a tiny, tiny person. None of them fit me, not a single one. I was pretty disappointed. I've given to children in the neighborhood, literally. This is a gas station in Benin. The little bottles are for motorcycles and scooters, which you see everywhere. The big ones are for vehicles, cars. I never saw a traditional gas station like we would understand with a pump. This was how you bought gas all over the country. This is a street scene in Dahomey, which was the old slave capital. That woman on the building there is a hairstylist and makeup artist. And you see she's got pictures. She's holding all her makeup brushes in the painting. I just love that. This is a coconut woman. They're on corners all over town. You pull up in your mini bike and grab a coconut instead of a Coca-Cola. This is a market town called Bohican. And then you see this. This is a painting on a wall in one of the towns, and it's celebrating all the kings of the era of slavery. You can see there in the middle of the lower row, Glele, the guy who was responsible for capturing all the people on the Clotilda, and then Gizo, the guy that was before him, his father. So these people who were the leaders of the slave era are being celebrated in the country by the Fawn today, and it's their legacy. If you look at the picture in the lower right, you got a butcher knife, like a cleaver, and a cut off arm and a cut off leg. There was no shying away from the brutality of the regime. This is a voodoo statue I saw somewhere in the country. And then you see things like this. Now look at the carvings on, this is the bridge of forgetting, or of no return. Look at these images. This is on a public monument in Benin. Look at this statue. This is an arresting statue. This is an enslaved person bound and gagged on the street in Benin. So something is going on there where the government is trying to have a sort of reconciliation between the Fon and these other tribes that were captured. Because as I mentioned, it's as easy as looking at people's faces to tell whether they were capturing your tribe or being captured. And they're worried about the Rwandan genocide, because Rwanda was just a tribal resentment gone awry. And so they have obvious tribal resentments in Benin. There are villages where people of Yoruba descent will not shop in stores owned by Fon. They will not send their kids to school with the Fon, because those were the people who captured them during slavery. And they still think of it and talk about it that way. It's a very raw wound, as evidenced by all these images that are all over in public, all over the country. Then there are these statues like this. You see, there's no face. There's this grid across the face, or this, where the face is looking down and away. These are statues meant to shame the living for slavery, and they're all over the country. Now, this is a group. This man in the suit with the lavender shirt is Mayor Glele. He is a direct descendant of King Glele, and he's the mayor of Abomey, which is the town where King Glele's palace was. It was the capital of the Dahomey Empire. When we came, he threw a big party for us because he was so excited to hear about how I found the ship and everything. In this picture, the guy in the military uniform is the leader of the armed forces. You can see his facial scarifications labeling him as a member of the Fon tribe. The man to the right of him is the minister of the interior. And he is one of the tribes that was captured. Right there in the government, you have these things. Now, the other thing I would point out in this picture, well, there are two things. There's the white guy. That's my friend Will that traveled with me, my best friend since junior high school. I brought Will with me because he was a relief driver for the Red Cross during the Rwandan genocide. So I thought he had good survival skills, which turned out to be true. So Will came with me. You can tell Will looks a little bit stewed in this picture, a little drunk. Mayor Glele really got us drunk. It started with his homemade pineapple whiskey, which was very powerful. I've drunk a fair bit of moonshine here in Alabama, and the pineapple whiskey tasted like turpentine, except not quite as good. And so anyway, we ended up blistering drunk at this big lunch they threw us, but it was incredibly fun. These are papayas growing on a tree just on the side of the road. Cujo in Barracoon talks about how as a kid, he and his siblings, he had 18 siblings because his father had 3 wives, would run through the woods hunting for fruit by smelling for oranges and pineapples on the breeze. Everything grows there. Well, we won't talk about that. And this is King Glele. This is the last living grandson of King Glele, who was king up until 1889, I think. The man who captured the people on the Clotilda. Now, think about that. This is this guy's grandson, and he's still alive. So this is not that far back in history, this story. It is still touching. There are still people alive who are connected to this story in Benin and in America, many of them. So then I went to visit Dada Dagbo at his palace, and we got very drunk there. Will, again, looks quite drunk, doesn't he? And you can't see it, but right in front of Dada Dagbo is an elephant skull. And on top of the elephant skull are a variety of little figurines that he was doing things to with different herbs and burning them and doing all, it was voodoo. He was doing a Vodun celebration right there as the leader of the religion. This was outside his palace, and interesting thing in this picture are all these women. These were his other wives. He had 8 wives in Africa. So he had the queen mother, but it turns out she lives in Harlem and doesn't live in Benin. She visits Benin. But Dada Dagbo had an assortment of wives. You may also notice he changed clothes between when we were, oh no, I don't have that picture. He changed clothes 3 times while we were there. And it was a lot of fun. You see a satellite dish there. CNN was playing in the background while we were chatting and meeting and everything. This is a woman at the market. I put this in here to talk about the tomatoes and the food. Tomatoes grow year round in Benin. They are a major food staple there, as are many other things you would recognize. This is a blackened trout that tasted just like a blackened redfish you got at K. Paul's in New Orleans. And there's a reason for that. The food in Benin, we always hear about the African influences on culture in America. The food in Benin tells the story. Benin is basically the source of Cajun cuisine, Creole cuisine. It arrived here in people from Benin. The best evidence I can give you is okra. Okra, black-eyed peas, they come from Benin. The word in Benin for okra is gumbo. So gumbo is an okra-based soup. The Clotilda captives, the women from the Clotilda, were famous in Mobile for the next 40 years for their stews they made, their gumbo. They would go to the lumber mills and other factories in the late 1800s going forward with these stews that they would serve for lunch. And these American men would come out and they were crazy about it. But that's where gumbo comes from. That's where many of the dishes in Louisiana come from. There's a wonderful TV show called High on the Hog on Netflix. The first episode is all about Benin and the connection to the cuisine from there to America. I highly recommend it, half hour. What you're looking at here is the dish that Mayor Glele served us. He looked at me when it arrived and he said, "Our chickens ride bicycles," in English. And he was speaking French otherwise. And I was it was kind of the first English I'd heard him talk. And I was like, huh, does he know what he just said? Well, sure enough, this dish is called poulet bicyclette, and it's kind of the national dish of Benin. And what it is a free-range chicken. And that is considered a treat there versus a farm-raised chicken like we're used to eating, big plump chickens. They want these wild chickens that run around and everything. And you see them all over town, and you see people chasing them to catch them and sell them. So this is poulet bicyclette. The white stuff is yam. In America, we call sweet potatoes yams, but this is the African yam. This was a major staple of the culture there, and sweet potatoes are a substitute, but they mash them and it becomes this kind of pliable thing. The stuff on the right is a fiery hot pepper tomato jelly. When I say fiery hot, everywhere you go in Benin, you see stacks of peppers for sale like this. They are really into heat in the food. I mentioned the ambassador of Benin. When he told me about his mother and father, he told me that in a restaurant, a seafood restaurant here. He'd ordered a Cajun fish that was supposed to be real spicy. It came and he called the waiter over. He was like, "I would like some pepper, please, a big bowl of pepper." The waiter brought him a bowl of black pepper. And he said, "No, no, no, cayenne pepper. I want a bowl of cayenne pepper." The waiter brought it took some negotiation, but he brought a bowl of cayenne pepper. The ambassador just poured it on top of his fish. I have never seen anybody eat cayenne pepper. He ate probably 3 or 4 tablespoons of cayenne pepper on top of this piece of fish. Sweat was pouring out of him. And he just said, "Oh, this is good. I felt like I was getting a cold from being in the boat, so I wanted to burn it out." So the food in Benin was just delicious. This is a guy on the side of the road cooking all these things. These are smoked fish. There are a few flies in the picture, but the fish were delicious. I ate them anyway. These are a few people from Ganvi. I just love these. If you can imagine, there's still 50,000 of them out there. They call it the Venice of West Africa. And you see these homemade sails, just extraordinary. And then there's the art. This is one of the Benin bronzes. This is a chameleon made in the 1600s in Benin. So we all think of the Renaissance and European art as the height of culture. The French recognized the art in Benin and they stole it. They stole 20,000 pieces of art out of Benin when they took over as a colonial power in 1892. Just this year, Macron has said he's going to give it all back. And they are funding the creation of two $25 million museums in Benin to house this stuff. The Smithsonian is designing the museums and involved in this. That's great. It's really cool that the Smithsonian is going to help build this museum to celebrate this culture that destroyed all these other cultures and then those destroyed cultures. Meanwhile, here in America, we are in Alabama totally unable to get a museum built for the Clotilda. The Clotilda, right now in Africatown, there is a prefab metal building that the county paid for that's going to house artifacts temporarily until hopefully something better can be made. The state is so far refusing to dig up the ship and put it on display, which is, to me, the most important thing about this story. So I'm working with a group here to build a museum here. We want to build it on the 42-acre site of an abandoned housing project in Africatown that was called Happy Hills. The land for the 42-acre housing project was stolen from Africatown residents in the 60s to build this housing project. It was condemned in 2010 and finally razed and bulldozed last year. So there's 42 acres in the heart of Africatown. What we want to do is build a museum there to house the wreck of the ship and tell the story of the 110 people who came aboard the ship. Because as I've explained, it is the most well-documented history of slavery ever. The Clotilda is an internationally important historic artifact. They have found parts of 12 slave ships prior to the Clotilda. The Clotilda is the only one that was intact. It is the only one that was involved in the American slave trade. It is the only one where we know anything about the people who traveled aboard it. In the Smithsonian, there is in the African American History Museum in DC, there's a piece of a slave ship about this big. It is from a South African slave ship that sank in port in Brazil. So that's where the legacy is. So now I'm afraid I'm afraid it may be a critical race theory protest, but so far the state is refusing to dig up the ship. They keep talking about preserving it in situ, which means leaving it to rot in the mud. So I am fighting against that every way I can. I had an article in Time Magazine recently and stuff. If the Smithsonian can help build a museum in Africa for this stuff, we should build one here. This is my last slide. In this picture, you see these three guys. The guy on the right, the white fellow, is a descendant of Captain William Foster. He contacted me after the first ship turned out not to be the Clotilda. He wrote me an email saying, "I'm sorry you didn't find the Clotilda. I'm really embarrassed and ashamed that my ancestor was the guy who did this." And then he asked me if I could connect him to any relatives of Captain Foster's I'd found down here. Well, it so happens I could. One of Foster's descendants tried to sell several artifacts from the Clotilda to one of Mayer's descendants in 2005. Only one Mayer family member ever agreed to speak with me, and they have never had any interaction with the people in Africatown in the modern era. They won't go meet with them. They won't talk to them. They won't apologize for all of this stuff that happened. So I tell this guy, Mike Foster, this. I said, look, I've got these relatives of Foster's who have the desk out of the Clotilda. They have the chair from the captain's cabin, and they have the clock. And I want to get them. And they have the original journal from the Clotilda's captain. So will you call them? They hung up on me because as soon as I told them who I was, that I was a reporter, they hung up on me. So he calls them, he befriends them as a relative, and they start talking and getting to know each other and talking about ancestry.com and all. This goes okay for a couple days until he tells them, and they admit to him they have artifacts from the Clotilda. So then he tells them, well, you should put those in a museum. I'm working with Ben Raines, and they hung up on him. So I said to him, I was like, well, Mike, I got another mission for you. The people in Africatown would love to meet somebody from the American side of the Clotilda story. Will you come and meet with them? And he's like, I don't know. They'd probably be pretty mad. I don't want to, and I was like, no, that's not where they are. If you come here, they will hug you. They will love you. They just want to meet with someone and have a reconciliation as a healing measure. So he agreed to come from Montana. And Mike he's a Vietnam vet. And so he came, and we were in my truck waiting to go meet with the descendants of people who arrived on the Clotilda. And he had taken off his wedding ring and told me he wasn't going to admit that he had a wife and daughters. And I said, why not? And he said, I'm afraid somebody may want to do something bad to me to punish me for what my ancestors did. So he was genuinely scared. I took him to the meeting with the Clotilda descendants immediately. As soon as he said, I'm so sorry for what my ancestor did, they all started hugging him. It was this incredibly powerful moment for him. He met hundreds of ancestors or descendants in the next 2 days while he was here, including these two guys. The guy in the middle is Gary Lumbers. He is Cujo Lewis's great-great-grandson. He was actually living in Cujo's house when the city of Mobile condemned it and tore it down. So imagine that. Cujo's great-great-grandson grew up in the house he built with the other Clotilda captives in 1870. And Mobile tore it down to build the hazardous waste route is what it is. This big bridge and the road they built through Africatown, they built so that they could avoid taking the hazardous waste on Interstate 10 through downtown Mobile. Instead, they said, let's reroute it through downtown Africatown. And when they did that, they destroyed downtown Africatown's business district. That's part of the 42-acre museum. We want to build a new business district on the 42 acres with, today in Africatown in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were grocery stores, restaurants, barber shops, doctor's offices, pharmacies, everything, movie theaters. Today, there's not a single business in Africatown. And it's because of environmental racism, the city of Mobile systematically working to destroy Africatown. So we want to rebuild all that at that site and have a theater troupe there, based there. Anyway, so this is Gary Lumbers in the middle. On the left is Darren Patterson. Darren is the president of the Clotilda Descendants Association. He grew up in Africatown. He did not know he was a descendant of the Africans until he was 60 years old, after his mother died. He came back to Africatown on a visit, and two old women came up to him who were friends of his mother's. And they chatted, and they said, well, Darren, you should come. We're having a descendants meeting today. You should come. You should join the Descendants Society. And he said, well, I'm not a descendant. And they said, yeah, you are. What are you talking about? And he said, I'm not related to the Africans. And they said, well, Aunt Eva was your great aunt, right? And he said, yeah. And they said, well, her father was one of the Africans. He had grown up knowing this woman, his great aunt, Eva Allen, who was the last child born to one of the Clotilda captives. She lived up into the 1990s. All his life, she would tell him he was African. And she would tell all these stories about the Africans and things. And his mother would say, don't believe anything Aunt Eva says. She's crazy. She's not African, and neither are you. And so Darren, he knows his mom was trying to make him focus on where he was going rather than where he came from, is how he phrases it today. But he talks about having his history hidden from him and how he wishes he had known she was African all this time. So I took these three guys up the river to the site of the Clotilda. None of them had ever been. And they all wanted to see it because it played a role in all of their family stories. And we got up there, and I suddenly had this realization. And I said to them, guys, this is the first time an Allen, a Lewis, and a Foster have been at this spot since the night the ship was burned. And they hugged and they cried, and they had, this moment. And then they decided they were all going to go to Benin together, and they were going to travel around and try and help with the reconciliation there, saying, and Darren said it, he said, I think if they could see the descendant of a slaver and the descendants of some of the people that this guy's ancestor enslaved, all hugging and laughing on stage together, maybe we can help them heal too. And then the pandemic happened, and so they haven't been able to go. But that's the end of my talk. If y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer. I'm going to stop the screen share now.
Thank
All right.
Thank you.